So we're going to common factor this rational function here. Okay, so I've kind of told us, normally you have to figure out if you're going to common factor. I take a look at the top. I mean, I can factor 1 out of anything. But what actually helped me is I'm going to do a little rearranging before I do anything, okay? I'm going to line up over this fraction here. I'm going to line up the constants and the variables. So on top, I'm actually going to make this -1 plus 2t. It's still the exact same thing. I just rearranged the two terms. Okay, and the reason I did that is so that it'll be a little easier if we do figure out common factoring, what we're going to need to kind of common factor out. So this becomes 4, that's the constant above it, and 8t. So you'll see the variables are kind of lined up here, and the constants are lined up. That's going to come in really handy in the next step. Okay, so then we'll drop down. I'm going to try common factor. Now, if I take a look, I'll tell you, I know there's going to be a problem right off the bat. This one's a negative, and this one's a positive. If I'm going to be able to do any type of like eliminating, I'm going to need those numbers to be the same. So I'm actually going to want to common factor the negative out of either the top or the bottom. I'm actually going to common factor it out of the top just so we get used to this idea, okay? I'm going to common factor -1 out. So when I take -1 out of this bracket, I end up with positive minus 2t. So positive 1 minus 2t. I essentially took the negative out, okay? That's going to come in handy here in this question. It's something that's always forgotten that you can do, and it actually comes into really handy. So now we have 4 minus 8t. I need to find a common factor. So I can write out all the factors of 4. Factors of 4 are 1, 2, and 4. And factors of 8 are 1, 2, 4, and 8. I need the GCF, the greatest common factor. And in this case, that actually happens to be the number 4. So I'm going to common factor out 4 from the denominator, okay? So our numerator is staying the same at -1, 1 minus 2t. And then in our numerator, or denominator, I should say, we're going to common factor out the value of 4. So we'll get 4 outside the brackets. And then 4 divided by 4 gives me 1. -8t divided by 4 gives me -2t. And I can actually go through those steps here. I know I didn't quite. I should do it over here. The original was -1 minus 2t, and we factored out -1. So essentially dividing by -1 each time, we would get -1 divide -1, that's +1. -2t divide -1 is +2t. And on the side over here, when we common factor out the number 4, 4 minus 8t, so it's kind of like a side calculation. We're taking the number 4 out of both, so we get 4 on the outside. 4 divided by 4 is 1. -8t divided by 4 is -2t. Oops. Oh, that was positive originally, so that becomes negative. I'm like something wrong there. Let's turn this into a negative. -2t. So now that I've done that, are these steps okay? How I did the common factoring here?
Could you go over one more time?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So the very first one, I'm going to highlight it and I'm going to draw it on the side here so it makes a little more sense. So here's our highlighter. I'm going to focus on this one. Let's move down on the left side of the page. I'm looking at the original. So I'm going to go back to the original question, which was -1 minus 2t. Okay. In terms of numbers, I got to think of greatest common factors. So, well, one of my numbers is -1 and the other one is -2. So what are factors of 1? A lot of times in elementary school when we have done this, we would have only focused on positive values, but there's technically a negative value for all of them too. For instance, 1. Well, what are the factors of 1? Well, they're 1, but it's also -1, right? If I do 1 times 1, sorry, what am I doing here? Factors of -1 are 1 and -1. You have to multiply 1 by -1 to get -1, right? So those are the two factors.
Yeah.
What about -2? Well, I have to multiply by 1, and I'd have to multiply that by -2, or I can multiply by -1 and +2. Okay? So there's quite a few there, but if we look, there's a common factor between each of them. the common factor happens to be -1. I can take -1. That's the greatest common factor. In fact, it's I could technically take out the number 1, but that's not going to change anything. And in our case, we do want to change. So I have two common factors. Their values are about the same. But if I take out 1, I don't get any change. So I'm going to take out -1 because that's going to flip my signs. So when I do the common factoring, we'll rewrite the original equation here. -1 minus 2t. Okay, we're going to common factor. So we're going to take that -1 out. So when we do that, we put it outside of the brackets. And essentially what we're doing is we're dividing each of the terms by that number. So -1 divided by -1 is any number divided by itself, like 5 divide 5, 7 divide 7. You're just going to end up with the number 1 in its place. -2 divide -1. Well, negative divided by a negative is a positive. Wait, sorry. Is this one a positive? I can't remember. Sorry, it was a positive to start. I'm going to make sure I do that right. It was a positive to start. Okay? So actually, when I do this +2, this should be -1 and -2 and +1 and +2. Didn't change anything. We still have our negatives.
Yeah.
+2t divide -1. Well, it's a positive divided by a negative. So we get a negative value. Negative. And anything divided by 1 is just going to be the original number itself. -2t. Okay? So that's how we got this thing up here. As for the denominator on the other one, same concept, right? Greatest common factor. We wrote them on the side. Technically, there's 4. There's 1 times 4, and 2 times 2. But I could actually also have -1 times -4 and -2 times -2. These are all possibilities too. So keep that in mind. You can also factor out negatives. What about 8? Well, 8 gives us, there's 1 times 4 and, whoops, what am I talking about? 1 times 8 and 2 times 4. There's also their counterparts, -1, -8, -2, -4. Okay, a lot of common factors. 1, whoa, that's not a highlighter. Let's do yellow here. 1 and 1, 4 and 4, 2 and 2, -1, -1, -4. So lots of common factors here. We want to take out the largest absolute value, okay? And when we take out the largest absolute value, we've actually got two answers, positive and -4, okay? From looking at this, I knew that I needed to take the positive one out, but let's say I didn't have that intuition. I wasn't sure. I'm going to take out the -4 and just show you, okay? This was our original number. We had 4 minus 8t, and we're going to common factor out -4. So I write the -4 instead of the front of the set of brackets, and we essentially divide each of these by -4. When I divide 4 by -4, that gives me -1. -8t divide -4. Well, the two negatives make a positive, and 8 divide 4 is 2, and the t stays the same. I could have done that. And if I draw your attention, actually, I'm going to draw the rational out here, and then maybe I'll get rid of it after. I would have had this. -1 times 1 minus 2t over -4, -1 plus 2t. And if you look at it carefully, nothing's actually the same here. So I can't do any simplifying. But if I'd actually factored a +4, okay, so if I'd taken that away, that would change the two signs in here. This would become positive, and this would become negative. And when that happens, take a look at those brackets. I can factor out those brackets now. Okay, so when I factor out the brackets, I left with -1 over 4. That's nice, but I did forget a step. I'm supposed to find restrictions. Okay, so I shouldn't have actually done that that simplifying yet. I want to take this denominator here, and I want to set it equal to, or set it not equal to 0. 4 is equal to, whoops, what am I talking about? 4 times -2t is not equal to 0. Okay, so I got 4 on the outside here. If I divide both sides by 4, these 4s create a 1. And essentially, like an idea of canceling out, it becomes 1 minus 2t does not equal 0 divide 4, still 0. We bring the 1 over, we would end up with -1. And because there's a 2 there, we divide both sides by -2. We end up with t cannot equal 1 over 2. positive 1 over 2. So there's our restriction. Here's our simplification. And that's our restriction along with it, okay? And essentially, we just had to do common factoring. It's just sometimes there's a little bit of a guessing game with common factoring because we don't know, because technically you want the greatest absolute value common factor. Let me zoom in a little.
Yeah.
So sometimes we have to divide the negative value or the positive value. We might have to do both to really get the true answer, okay? You'll get intuition for it after a while.